very much to the panel. You know, we started by talking about the spectrum. You know, sometimes these technologies are overhyped, sometimes it's doom and gloom. We have not erred on the overhyped side today. So we appreciate being grounded in reality here. We have got ample time for questions. So I'm actually going to start with one. Since this, you know, this has been a very cautionary note to it. And so Illah, the first question is for you. You know, you raised the specter of sort of uncertainty for AI. It's the long pole in the tent. Yet it's sort of, driverless cars sort of feel inevitable to many of us. So how good is good enough? You know, we know there's always going to be the unknown unknowns, but how good do you think is good enough?
So I asked one of the car companies this because they started the whole mission statement on the board by saying, our job is to save lives. That's not, I believe, what the stock market is about, but they said we want to maximally save lives. And so we're working so hard to make cars have no driver at all. And my response was, well, okay, if you really want to save lives, every year you spend trying to get from 95% to 96.5% efficient, and God knows how long it'll take to get to 99.9% efficient, every year you do that instead of deploying them and mass marketing them is lives lost. So why don't you design for a driver? In airplanes, we have training, we have autopilots, we know how to engage and disengage them. We've dealt with this question of cognitive load and how you can have a situation awareness. Couldn't you use a human factors style approach to actually design for that? And his response is, oh, that's what we're doing. Yet the marketing around it is about driverless cars. Fundamentally, I think it is good enough. It is true that if you look at high-speed accidents, that's mostly the highway. That's where you're getting most of the fatalities. And if you have systems that can understand when a human being is sleepy or driving poorly, we could put those in cars now and save lives. If really we're about saving 37,000 lives a year, we're not doing this right. We're not starting with that goal and working backwards to the shortest possible path to win that goal over. Instead, we have companies saying there's $1 trillion marketplace. How do I acquire a $1 trillion marketplace, which has nothing to do with solving the problem from the ends back to what we have as means?
Thank you very much. All right, now we're going to go to the audience. Remember,
sorry, can I tack a little bit onto that one?
Yes,
it's a very good point.
Sure.
If you deal with epidemiology, you deal with space, time, and you deal with denominators and numerators. The problem in that environment is that you focus completely on one statistic, which is the fatality. The fatality is critical, it's humanly meaningful, but you don't have the bottom line, which is the number of non-accidents. Human beings are absolutely awful at non-events, and if they weren't, Las Vegas wouldn't exist. The point is, what is a non-accident? What is the spatio-temporal metric of a non-accident? And that's a hard thing to work out. You can use the length of the car, and you can use an average miles an hour to calculate the number of potential accidents. But when you do that, when you actually try to run that sort of Gedanken quasi-experiment, what you find out is human beings are wonderfully, wonderfully capable of controlling these vehicles. The number of opportunities for an accident per day are in the multiple trillions and maybe more. And so the point is, when this technology offers to improve that safety, it has to know what the baseline is. If you're going to triage, you have to know what the baseline of the triage is in order to know whether you're improving it or not. And the absolute numbers, while they are tragic and while they are very impactful, do not tell that whole story. And so the offer of safety is sometimes one that can be a sort of two-edged sword, as it were, maybe also as the offer of mobility and freedom, as our German engineer offered in that particular video. So I only ask you to think about that before we sort of embrace that idea of, oh, it'll be safe and no one will be injured. I think that's, you're perfectly correct. That's a very poor sales technique, but anyway, sorry.
Great addition, thank you. All right, let's take a question from the audience. Up at the top there.
Hi, what about hacking? How vulnerable are these systems to hacking and cybersecurity issues? Recently, we've had a lot of people who have purposely driven vehicles into big crowds. Could these vehicles be engineered to do that as well?
Yeah, that's great. Jack, do you have any, I don't know, from your stance at Wired, are you guys focused on that sort of issue?
Yeah, it's something that we're very definitely covering and very definitely aware of, and an excellent point. It sort of just speaks to how broad this field is and the number of different sciences that are involved, you know, as well as behavioral science, human factors, engineering, everything else. We need these sort of security minds working on these things too. We've actually seen specific examples of hackers hacking into a Jeep vehicle that was driving on the highway, and they got pretty basic control of that vehicle, but it wouldn't be hard to imagine as these cars become more like computers on wheels that they will become easier to hack. And autonomous vehicles are being used in military environments already, so there are precedents for these types of vehicles to be deliberately programmed to take lives. So yeah, it's a conversation that we need to have. People need to be aware of that risk. I think the danger is that that becomes an inflated risk. We'll get one incident or you know, sort of one hacking attack, and that generates headlines and overtakes the conversation to an extent. So again, that sort of responsibility falls on us to make sure we're communicating all the time the risks versus the benefits of all these technologies.
Illah, sure.
3 quick points about hacking. It's a very important question. You know, when you talk about cars plowing into crowds, one response people have as a knee-jerk is, we should have them be autonomous cars so you can't do that with them. So one thought the techno-optimist has is actually technology will stop that bad thing from happening. And as Jack pointed out, first of all, you can hack the car's computer systems. You can hack the networks that the cars depend on, like the shared maps. You can hack the environment, like the stop sign. And what's really scary are situations where people identify ways to hack the car such that a small number of cars misbehave and nobody knows they've been hacked. Because you hack the environment in such a way that these sensors, which aren't human eyes, do poorly, we may not be able to detect that. And so we simply chalk it up to bad statistics. And that to me is really frightening, is diagnostic transparency and realizing hacking is happening may come quite late. And that's very unfortunate indeed.
So the first one I think was hacked through the entertainment system, which was an interesting one because it took a long time to do, and now it's quicker, of course. Anything, you're perfectly correct, anything that happens under approximately 45 to 50 milliseconds is below human temporal resolution, and you won't know that it's going on. But in my lab, we asked that question, can you trust your robot? And one of the nice things about it is that we found that if a human being transgresses and does something badly, human beings are slow to forgive, but if the robot transgresses and does something badly but says sorry, human beings forgive the robot faster than they give other people. So I've put that forward to my wife as a rationale for a robot spouse in the future, but that has not particularly gone over well in the domestic situation. But can you trust the robot? And can you then trust the robot not only not to do something inappropriate, but not in that case to take life? And I think that's an absolutely great question, and that is a matter of bounding the access capability. But again, it's wide open prairie out there right now.
Thank you. Excellent question. We're going to go ahead and take one from Twitter here. I think this is particularly germane to this discussion. Haley on Twitter here says, the current issue isn't ethics. These questions have been enumerated and debated endlessly. Isn't this really a policy question? That is, how to incorporate the ethics into the legal, economic, and public values concerns. So how do we get how do we get the fodder for today's discussion into the policy discussion? Thoughts on that?
So there's a few interlinked issues here. First of all, yes, it's a legal issue, but it's much more than that. It's a business innovation issue. What are the ways in which we create feedback systems in business, in the capitalist structures that we live in, which cause us to go down pathways that are so poorly laid out, as this autonomous driving one is right now? And how do we change that? I mean, when you build a building, we think about economic impact assessments. And if we're building this building in a wetland, how are we going to remediate for that? We don't think about, Fareed Zakaria said the #1 job category for males in America, in I think 47 states, is something involving a steering wheel. So we don't have, employment remediation programs that an Uber has to deal with. Because if they succeed, they're going to lay off more than 30% of males in the US in some fashion. We don't have that approach to business ethics and business innovation. On the legal side, of course, it's shambles. because tort and liability questions are a disaster here. Who's responsible if you drive a car? And it gets better, right? What if the car has machine learning? It actually learns from you. It's self-driving, takes your commands, drives. You tell it to break the speed limit because it's going too slow, and that's dangerous. So now it breaks the speed limit, now it crashes. Accountability is a disaster when you have a complex system like that, just as it will be in autonomous military weaponry. And nobody has a good system for that. That's why Google says things like, well, we'll just own all the cars. We'll reinsure them ourselves, and we'll just lend them to you, because anything else makes our head hurt. So fundamentally, we don't have any of those processes in place. I do believe the ethics also matters, and the core issue on the ethics side is, when you become a computer scientist in most universities in the US and become a dude who's creating, or a dudette, creating these cars, you have had 0 classes in ethics and morality in your entire career in undergraduate education. So that means you've become somebody who can change society, put 3,000-pound vehicles on the road that can kill people, have to make decisions about killing person A or person B, and you haven't even learned what ethics means.
We talked yesterday about cross-disciplinary collaboration. Are we seeing ethicists starting to be part of these tech development teams and autonomy labs, at least in academia?
Not yet.
I mean, I think we're seeing some examples. I've visited some labs where they're definitely having these thoughts and having these discussions, but definitely not enough. And this is not the only area in life where technology is moving much faster than policy and legislation. You know, you look at the power that we perceive Facebook as having had with potential impacts on the last election in this country. A lot of these decisions and these very sort of influential moves are being made in Silicon Valley, not in Washington, D.C., and that's a much bigger question than just driverless cars.
Great point.
So can I need to take off from something my colleague said there. We have to at least pay some respect to Norbert Wiener and especially the latter book that he wrote, The Human Use of Human Beings. We are re-engineering feedback loops within our society. And some of the questions that I think are important for science are the fact that feedback loops that we see logically in engineering are considered obligatory in engineering, are discretionary in relation to political and social discourse. And so we see a very strong mismatch between the way in which we would think about engineering a system versus engineering a human community. And the problem is that those feedback loops in relation to information theory that was measured before actually reinforce or dissipate according to the way in which they are enforced. And one of the greatest problems that science has right now is that it has no obligatory place in our social organizational structure. It has a discretionary place, and the discretion is the discretion to be ignored. It has no obligatory place, and until it does have that place at the table, it will continue to be a handmaid of whatever vacillation and idiocy goes on locally. So that is where we've got to make the step, not greater and greater advisory capacities. Our advice will be heard or misheard or disheard eternally if we do not get a place at that table. And that's the step that the communication needs to make, not just telling the next generation that science is a good thing.
Thank you. All right, I want to take another question from the audience.
Hi. Risk and anxiety aside, how desirable are autonomous vehicles? Are there any examples from history of automation possibilities that were partly or wholly rejected because people enjoyed the activities that they would replace? And given that some people, presumably, including myself, like driving and would like to continue driving, what does that mean for a future in which autonomous vehicles coexist with self-driven, well, not self, with cars driven by people?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I mean, some people, the mix of robots and people driving on the roads is what they fear most, and they can't wait to get all the people off the road. And so that is a very interesting question. Who wants to take that first crack at that?
Can I take a first crack at that? I deal with that. You're dealing with the problem that's called the mixed equipage problem, the mixture of human beings and robots together. And again, harking back to the point I think Jack made originally, which is a lot of the testing is done with simple longitudinal lateral control, usually on unidirectional highways. And the mixed equipage problem becomes much greater when the complexity of the interaction of the environment becomes much greater. But you bring something up that's much more important, which is enjoyment. Quality of life is contingent upon what you enjoy doing, and petrol heads just love driving around in circles in strange vehicles, and they should be free to do so at some point. And so we can't give away those things. There are some technologies which I've examined, like guns, that last hundreds of years, and people value them as antiques and machines, and they love those things as physical objects, and we are liable to see the same thing happen with vehicles. A Model T and a Model A ought to have some sort of access to the world. But is there an example of where people love something so much that they gave up the thing? There is an enforced example on something called Sarah Island, which is in Macquarie Harbour in Tasmania, where the convicts were forced to give up all forms of tools as a punishment, but that was not for the love of the business, but Luddites in Love. I think that's a good name for a Broadway show, but I appreciate what you said. Yeah, people love these things.
Jack, something to add?
Yeah, I can just tell you that I ask this exact question. I ask it of car companies all the time, and I ask Lamborghini, known purely for making enjoyment machines, how they see themselves surviving in the future. And they see AI, they say, as being a supplement. It will be your co-driver. So you could actually use AI in the car to teach you how to drive better. You could take your car out on a track and do loops, and the AI will drive the first few for you because it will do it better than a human, and then it will gradually let you take over. It will step in where it needs to, and it will help you enjoy your car more. And then when you've had your fun, it will deal with the stop-and-go traffic on the way home. So they see a blend, certainly in the near future.
Well, we certainly would need the steering wheels and the brakes to stay in the car in order to facilitate that future.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a sort of a blend of vehicles in that sense as well. I mean, I'm a petrol head myself. I definitely don't want to give up driving, but I do love it when I have a modern car with one of these systems in, and I sit in freeway traffic in LA and I don't have to touch the pedals for a while. So yeah, I think we'll see a combination certainly for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Did you have something to add, Illah?
Yeah, just briefly, this will sound like a tangent, but I think it relates nicely. The African American Museum here has a display. One part of the display shows a cotton gin. And the sign is really interesting because it talks about how the cotton gin automated an aspect of production. And the very fact that you automated one aspect of production created bottlenecks out of other aspects of production, specifically cotton picking. And so the sign talks about the degree to which this increased the amount of abuse and pressure on slaves on land to do much, much higher levels of cotton picking than before. And I think we need to keep track of that. This isn't exactly about enjoyment, it's kind of the question on its head. But we need to understand that when you automate something, you create bottlenecks and pressures that may actually make the amount of work we do in other areas less dignified. And it's a really important thing to keep track of. These are the unintended consequences we don't think about at the systems level until they happen. And that's writ large for automation in general. So we have to watch out for that systems result too.
Thank you all. We are up against our time here. I just want to re-emphasize the importance of these kinds of conversations. If nothing else, what we have established is that the future of these technologies cannot simply be relegated to the computer science major in the academic lab or the Silicon Valley startup that may be pursuing goals that aren't necessarily aligned with societal values. And so I hope that we will continue to become more informed on the technology and the issues, and that you will all consider contributing to these conversations as well. Let's thank our speakers one more time.